why don't we start with you telling us something about you and how you ended up and entered the life and world of being a writer.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. This is great, especially to be with Christine with our history together. Um, I'm Cherokee, and so I would say to you OCO, which means hello in Cherokee. Hoklotubbe, for those of you who may be familiar with the Choctaw language, is a Choctaw name. So I'm Cherokee, but I have a Choctaw name, and that's my husband's fault. But I write about the area where I grew up. I grew up in northeastern Oklahoma near an area, a small town called Uchi. And when you see that word in the book, a lot of people are maybe wondering how to pronounce it, and it's Eucha, but it's a Cherokee word and it's pronounced Uchi. And so I grew up in that area, and when I went to school at OU, I graduated with a degree in political science and then went into the banking business. And I spent 21 years in the banking business before my Choctaw knight in armor came along and whisked me away to somewhere else. And at the time, he was working for the government in Hawaii. And so I left Oklahoma at the age of 45, first time married, went to Hawaii, and I couldn't get a job, which was really unsettling for me because I'd always been on my own, had a good job, but I couldn't get a job being an outsider there. And so my husband encouraged me to do something else, something I wanted to do. And I said, well, I think I want to write. And I think I want to write a book about how terrible women are treated in the banking business. And he said, yeah, sure. Okay, go ahead, go do that. So, so I took some classes at Maui Community College and kind of renewed my thinking about how to put together sentences. And I started writing. And with my background in banking, my first book, you probably won't be surprised to learn, starts out with a bank robbery. And it was based on a real event, but nobody was killed in the real event. But when I started writing, it just took a 90-degree turn and turned into a mystery. And so, and I think that had a lot to do with the inspiration I had from Tony Hillerman at the time, because I really liked his books. So that's how I kind of got started in writing. I started writing while we were there in Hawaii.
So when you decided to make, as you were writing the book, was it going to be a novel to begin with and then went into a mystery? How did you become a mystery writer out of all the genres and types of writing you could have chosen?
I think it was because I really enjoy reading mysteries, and that I think I like the element of surprise. I like the puzzle, having to solve the puzzle part, and so I didn't really know how to do that, but I just worked at it, and that's how I ended up writing mysteries. I think it was just based on my knowledge of all the mysteries that I had read.
So when you're writing a mystery book or your novels, your mysteries, how do you keep track of all of the details? When in preparation for the book club, I started looking at all the number of characters and the consistency, among all those characters and how and what they were doing and their actions. in order to fit everything together to come to that, the point of the mystery of who killed.
Well, I have this huge whiteboard in my office. And when I come up with a character, I try to make a resume for them, so to speak, online in a Word document. And then on the whiteboard, I keep track of all my characters. I list them out and list what their description is or what their place in the book is, kind of what they look like and what their relationship is to the other characters. And I try to keep track of their ages that way. And that way, all I have to do is look up at the whiteboard and say, well, he couldn't do that because he's not the right age or something like that. And it would remind me then of the different characteristics of the different characters, because every character needs to have its own little quirky thing to make them different.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that, and each of them certainly do have that. And so what about Sadie? How, and all the other characters, how are you drawing? You mentioned a bit of, you're drawing from some of your personal experiences first with the first book in terms of banking, but how does all of the characters, are they representative of people you know, or are they purely fictional characters? How do you come up with those biographies of each of the characters in your books?
Right, right. Some of the characters are based on people I know somewhat, or they might be a combination of more than one person I know. In the last book, Betrayal at the Buffalo Ranch, Clyburn was kind of his looks and his thing with the cigar reminded me of a man that I knew when I was growing up that worked with my dad. And so how he used his cigar and everything, I just kind of remembered how he was and wrote that into that character. A funny thing about Lance, who has turned into one of the most favorite characters in the books, when I wrote my first book and the acquiring editor, Patty Hartman, sent me the reviews on it, and she said they really liked it because it was reflective of modern day Indian life. And they wanted me to add another Indian character, which is not easy to do with a book that's finished. It's kind of like throwing a rock into a pond and you see all these ripple effects all the way in the water. That's what happens with a character. And so I went back and I added Lance, who was a police officer. And so that's why he doesn't have as big a role in the first book as he does the later books. But everybody loves Lance now. And I just kind of made Lance based on maybe people that I had seen and growing up. And my husband and I were in a restaurant one time near Tahlequah, and I looked up and I said, "Oh my gosh, that looks like Lance." And Lance doesn't exist except in my head. So that's kind of how I come up with different characters.
So you already have somebody who could, well, I guess not a movie star, but you have the type that you need for any movie spin-offs on your books.
Exactly.
That sounds great. So in each of your novel, in each of the mysteries, Sadie has a different job. So she is a woman about the town and really in very professional fields too, in terms of businesses and banking. Could you talk about that progression from Sadie's earliest career in banking to running her travel company in the Betrayal at Buffalo Ranch?
Okay, yeah. In the first book, I think I was drawing on my own experience having worked in the bank for so many years. And so I gave her that role of working in the bank, and it seemed to work out really well. And when I started my second book, I just didn't have the heart to put her back in the bank again. So the second book, The American Cafe, is based on my aunt's restaurant, which was also called the American Cafe in the little town of Jay, Oklahoma. And so a lot of my experiences as a child growing up and being in that restaurant, I drew on that knowledge and of how that restaurant actually was run. And so I thought it would be kind of fun for her to buy a restaurant. And so that's how I got her as running the restaurant. And of course, at the end of that book, and as a spoiler, I guess, the restaurant is moves to somebody else's ownership. And so when I got to the third book, she didn't have a job because she'd gotten rid of the restaurant. And so I thought, well, why not give her a job with a travel agency, because that way she can go lots of different places and get into trouble in all these different places a lot easier if she's a travel agent. And so that's kind of how we moved to being a travel agent. And of course, I wanted to make it a travel agency that was originated in Maui, because then I could use my experience of living in Maui with her going to Maui in the third book.
You and Hawaii is a lovely place to have as a backdrop for a setting for the books. So you mentioned a bit about the publishing process. There you are, you finished your book, it goes out for review, and then the editor, a good friend, Patty Hartman, wanted you to add another character. And you mentioned that problem. Could you talk generally about the publishing process? And it's very hard to be published. It's not an easy process. And yet, I don't know if from our perspective, perhaps it looks effortless, but I'm sure it's not.
Well, when I finished my first book, I didn't really know what to do with it. And I had sent it out to a lot of agents and gone to writers' conferences and met with different agents, and was having zero luck with everyone. And I belonged to a group called WordCraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. And I was at a conference in Oklahoma. I think it might have been actually here in Norman. It was the annual gathering of the faithful. And I met and talked to Dr. Gary Hobson. And I had kind of a negative experience with an agent that was there at the conference, because she told me that my book was not nearly long enough. I had like 70,000 words, and she said, well, you need at least 125 to get it published. And she was just really negative about it. And then I went to the banquet, and Dr. Hobson's book, The Last of the Ophos, was about a 100-page book. And I started doing the math in my head, and I said, well, that can't be true. And so I talked to him after the banquet, and he took the banquet program, and he tore off a corner, and he wrote down Patty Hartman's name, and he said, contact her and tell her what you have, because at the time, I don't think the press was doing many fiction books. And he said, tell them what you have and see if they're interested. And so I did. I sent her an email, and she wrote back to me and said, well, send me your manuscript. And so I did. And of course, it goes through the review process there. And it was several months before I heard back. And I was thinking, oh, they're never going to answer me. It's a slow process. But
Yeah.
then I did get an answer that said, we like your book, but we want another character. And they gave me a certain amount of time to make those changes and send it back in, which I did. And everybody has been so wonderful at the University of Arizona Press to me. They've been so kind. From that point, it went to the copy editor, and I was priding myself in how clean my manuscript was, because I thought it was in tip-top shape. And the copy editor got through with it and sent it back to me. And I just couldn't believe she had a mark on every page. But she was just wonderful in, I believe, making my book so much better. And then, of course, when she got through with it, and then it went back to the book designer, and they decide how they're going to print it and do the cover. And then there's always the thing of choosing the title, because the title that I come up with when I write the manuscript is not always the title that the publisher wants to use, because they have lots of different reasons for that. And so there's discussion about that. And I have heard from other writers who have absolutely zero input into that. And the University of Arizona Press has been so kind and said, well, give us your input. And they wanted to make sure that it was okay with me how the title turned out. So it's just been a wonderful experience for me.